I personally haven't found any obstacles, but I think that that's because I'm very focused on what my goals are in the game. And my goals aren't social ones. If I had goals that were social in nature, if I felt like I wanted to always have good social interactions with people at the table, that I didn't want people to be mean to me, that I didn't want to have negative interactions with people at the table, then there would be obstacles to being a woman. But I don't think about it that way. I feel like when people are having negative reactions to me at the table, that is actually a good thing, because it means that they're emotionally wrapped up in my existence, which means that they're not going to play well. Now, that's not true for a lot of women. So what I can tell you is that, you know, the downside to being a female in this world, because, you know, poker doesn't have the same kind of glass ceiling because nobody's hiring you. Nobody's setting your salary. So it doesn't, there aren't a lot of the negatives that happen in business where, like, it's, you won't get promoted because your boss is a chauvinistic asshole, or you're getting paid less than your male colleagues, or, you know, any of that stuff just doesn't exist here because you're playing by your own wits and it's your own money, and, you know, you're just winning money according to how much better than the game you are. But that being said, when I was playing in Montana, I got called very bad names on a daily basis. So I would win a hand, and it would just be like a random hand, but it might be a really big pot, and the person would look at me and say, "You fucking cunt." And I'm not kidding. Like, that happened to me pretty much every day, which is an interesting reaction to losing a hand of poker. But all of the things that would have to do with, like, what you would sort of consider sexual harassment, or things that wouldn't be okay in everyday interaction, become fair game in a lot of players' minds at the poker table, because somehow they feel like that because you have agreed to sit down at the table, that you have also in some ways agreed that they're allowed to treat you however they want, because it was your choice to sit down in their world, if that makes any sense. So they seem to think it was okay to be using those words in relation to me. Now, that would be a very big negative for most women, I think. Being treated that way. I remember one time I won a hand from someone, and they looked at me and they called me a frigid bitch, which was really weird. I've been really overtly and disgustingly hit on at the table. I was playing in a game once with somebody who I won't say who they are, but they were actually a very famous television producer. And they kept saying to me every hand, they were like, "Can I look in your hole? What's in your hole? Can I get in there? Can I see?" Because you have hole cards. So they thought they were being funny with this pun. I was also playing once with a famous actor who had, he was eating lamb chops at the table, and he said, "Hey, do you want to try my meat?" And then after he was done with his meat, he lifted up the bone and he said, "What about my bone?" Now, obviously, none of that is appropriate in pretty much any circumstance, but I you know, faced with that regularly. So again, most women, I think, that would find that a negative. They would find that a downside. A lot of women end up not coming back to the table because they're treated that way. But it didn't bother me because I didn't look at it as any kind of statement on who I was or whether that was appropriate or whether that was okay to be being said to me, because, again, it wasn't like these people were my bosses. You know, it wasn't like it was their job to hire me. Their behavior makes it easier for me to take their money. So I never became, as I said, the rules of poker are you don't get emotionally invested in anything at the table. So that kind of behavior is only a downside if you're getting emotionally invested in what's happening at the table. And poker's a very unemotional game. So I just thought to myself, well, if they're behaving this way, how can I leverage it? How can I use that to my advantage? Because these guys are clearly chauvinistic, you know, dickheads. So let me see if I can't turn that around for me. So in that sense, I never considered there really to be any downside whatsoever to being a woman. And for me, it was all upside. And the upside really comes from the downside, which is that poker is about figuring out who your opponent is, figuring out how your opponent is going to behave. Because all of that stuff has to do with being able to, A, narrow down what their hand is, and then B, come up with the best line of play in relation to what their hand is or what you think their hand might be, the most mathematically profitable. Now, as a good poker player, what you're doing is you're watching the way that somebody behaves at the table. You see what they've done with past hands so that you can take, as you're in a hand with them, you can use that past information, who they are as a person. Are they conservative? Are they wild? Are they, you know, what are their hand ranges that you've seen them play in certain positions? How have they bet good hands? How have they bet bad hands? How have they behaved? All of that stuff. And you take all of that data that you've collected to that point about that player so that when you're in a hand with them, you can use all of that in order to predict their behavior and predict their hand. And you're constantly updating that based on what you see them do. The advantage to being a woman is that men are very unwilling to change their minds about who you are as a person, because the stereotypes that men have about women and the emotional reactions that men have about women have been built into them since they were little tiny babies. So it's very hard for them to undo a lifetime of stereotypes. And so they tend not to update their information about you based on who you are. So the best example that I can give about that is a hand that I actually played against somebody where this guy, and this was back when in Montana, this guy raised with king nine of diamonds, and I re-raised them with ace king of hearts, and they called me. And the board came a king and two small hearts. And so he flopped a king, but he had a 9 with it, and I flopped a king, but I had an ace with it. So I had by far the best hand. And he bet, and I raised, and he re-raised me, and I re-raised him, and he re-raised me, and I re-raised him, and he finally called. And then on the next card, he checked, and I bet, and he raised me, and I re-raised him, and he called. And then on the next card, he checked, and I bet, and he called. So I turned over my ace king of hearts, and noticed that at no time did I have the worst hand. I had the best hand literally from start to finish. I behaved completely rationally in the hand. And so anyway, I turned my hand over, and now he flips his hand face up on the table, and he's like, "You see what a lucky bitch she is? She's always so lucky. You know, what are you supposed to do? She's so lucky," you know, so on and so forth. And this really came from his inability to accept that I might just be a better player than him, and I might just have had a better hand than he did. He had to attribute it to luck because he was unwilling to update his stereotype of who I was as a person. Now, this person actually, I found out a few years later, beat his wife almost on a nightly basis. So you can imagine how strong his views of women were in terms of not wanting to give them credit. And I was really horrified when I found that out, but interestingly not surprised, because he was one of those C-word people. I sort of divide men into 3 categories. Well, 4 categories. There's men who are rational and they treat you as any other player at the table. So